I'm Leni Villagomez Reeves. I'm a Cuba solidarity activist. I'm active in Fresno branch. I've been going to Cuba often for quite a long time, sometimes with delegations, but more often on my own. I speak Spanish, of course. You'd guess that from my name, and though maybe not from my appearance. So yeah, my ethnicity is mixed and complicated. And I got my start in political action, if you can call it that. And I think you can with the United Farm Workers, which almost all of us are old enough to remember. And yeah, and here I am now.
Well,
So,
Lenny, Lenny, what did you do with United Farm Workers? Just out of
well,
curiosity.
first, I was first I was on the boycott like almost everybody, you know. Cesar sent everybody out. He said, "Stop the grapes." So, yep, I was very fortunate. I was sent to Berkeley, North Oakland, and it was an amazing life-changing experience. After that, just before the contracts were signed in 1970, I went back to Delano. I was in the hiring hall for a while, which was a very high pressure situation because, of course, everybody wants to work now. Um, and then I had another baby. And after that, I was lucky enough to go to work in the Rodrigo Terrones Clinic, which I had actually helped build the farm workers clinic at the 40 acres. And I was working as a lab aide. And after I had been there for about 2 months, the lab tech left. And so I was it. And it was great. The docs taught me. I passed proficiency tests. I ran the lab back in an era when we did white counts by hand. It was great. So, and then after that, I went to college and I went to medical school, and I worked at Valley Children's in the emergency room, Valley Children's in Fresno, not the one in San Jose, for many years. And I'm retired now, and Cuba Solidarity is mostly what I do.
Mm.
And so I am going to talk about how Cuba went from being a traditional macho homophobic society to the world leader in human rights, including LGBTQ plus rights and women's rights. But I want to start on a personal note. I have a really terrible sense of direction. And on a very early trip in Cuba, I got on the right bus, but going in the wrong direction. And it got to the end of its route in La Lisa, which is a what's called a marginal barrio in Cuban parlance. And of course, I had to get off. And I used my US and Mexican experience to react to my situation as an obvious foreign woman alone in a very poor urban area. And I followed groups of women around in a mild panic until it was finally time to board the bus again. And in a similar reaction, also early in my visits to Cuba, I was coming home from a concert late at night, and I got on in a jitney cab with a bunch of other people. You know, it's a fixed route taxi that picks up people along the way. Um, and the couple that was in there got off, and the woman got off. I'm alone in a car with two really huge guys. I almost jumped out in traffic in a panic. Well, um, you know, I later on I was telling these experiences to a Cuban friend, and first I was met with like total incomprehension. What was I talking about? And then when they understood what I was talking about, they almost fell off their chair with laughing. I mean, women's rights in Cuba are not limited to the legal and the formal. Women have the right, the actual right, not the just the written right, to be safe on the streets, in the buses, in all kinds of neighborhoods, at all times of the day or night. And it took some getting used to, you know. Now I'm probably less safe here in the US because I might react as if I were in Cuba and go sit in the back of the bus or something. In any case, process of change,
Mm.
how Cuba went from being a traditional homophobic macho society to the world leader in human rights, including LGBTQ plus rights and women's rights. Professor Yamila Gonzalez Ferrer, a prominent scholar and one of the principal authors of the Families Code, said, "We come from a patriarchal culture, from a culture in which there are many stereotypes, many prejudices linked to being a woman, being a man, also linked with boys, girls, and adolescents, also with the elderly, with people in a handicapped condition. When we put limits on these people, questioning their autonomy, their independence, and their ability to make decisions, we have to transform ourselves. And there is a transformation process, a cultural transformation, and it's occurring, and it has made great progress in Cuba. And I think that's remarkable. And I think to understand that transformation, we need to understand an essential element that's been ignored in most US commentary on Cuba, and that's the engagement of the Cuban population in evaluating, critiquing, amending proposed changes and reforms through mass organizations, through public forums, through national consultations, through mass meetings and referendums, as well as through their representatives in government. One of the most important of these mass organizations, and probably our counterpart in Cuba, I would say, is the Federation of Cuban Women, and it will celebrate its 64th anniversary in just a few days. The FMC, the Federation of Cuban Women, Federación de Mujeres Cubanas, was founded August 23rd, 1960, only 8 months after the triumph of the Cuban Revolution. The FMC has not only championed the rights of women, but has also played a vital role in fighting homophobia as well as other forms of discrimination. A principal leader of the movement for women's rights in Cuba and the founding president of the organization was Dilma Espín. This born revolutionary graduated in 1954 from the University of Santiago with a degree in chemical engineering. How many Chem-Es, women Chem-Es were there in the US at that time? Maybe zero. She joined the revolutionary movement in Cuba shortly afterwards and was one of the organizers and leaders of the armed uprising in Santiago that on November 30th, 1956, that was intended to coincide with and cover for the landing of the boat Rana, which brought Fidel and 81 others to begin the overthrow of the dictator Fulgencio Batista. He had canceled the elections and seized power in 1953. She remained a leader in the clandestine movement until she was spotted by Batista's folks, and then she joined the Ejército Rebelde, the armed struggle in the Sierra Maestra. After the triumph of the revolution, she dedicated her life to the struggle of Cuban women for equality. Of course, since the revolution, the legal and educational equality of Cuban women has never been in question. What the problems that have existed have been with the traditional attitudes of the culture and the second shift effect, which made women solely responsible for the home and family. The Federation of Cuban Women has a membership of about 85% of all Cuban women age 14 and over. The only requirements for membership are to be at least 14 and to want to join. And so it really is a mass organization. And as I said, over the years, the Federation of Cuban Women has been successful in creating a social and political atmosphere of support for women's rights. And I'm going to give you some examples. Cuba legalized abortion in 1965. That's 8 years before Roe v. Wade. It's 23 years before the equivalent Canadian Supreme Court decision. You know, people sometimes say Cuba was the first country in Latin America to legalize abortion. That's understating the thing. Cuba was the first country in the Western Hemisphere to allow women control over their own bodies. Within the Cuban free, universally accessible, community-based healthcare system, termination of pregnancy is a medical procedure available to women without restriction, and it's the woman who decides. Women who choose to have children are supported by this system with excellent prenatal care and community support that have reduced Cuba's infant mortality rates to below those of the US. The difference is even more marked for Black infants. Parental leave rights are also guaranteed. Cuba meets the UNICEF standards for parental leave. Need I say that the US does not? In 1979, the UN General Assembly approved the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW. And this is one group where I finally don't have to go into a long explanation about CEDAW. Cuba immediately signed and ratified this. And even prior to CEDAW, though, all discrimination against women had been outlawed by the original Cuban Constitution. And these protections have only been strengthened and increased in subsequent Cuban constitutions, most recently in 2019. We're going to talk about that. I'm going to quote Fidel, who said, "Revolution is changing everything that should be changed. It's full equality and freedom. It's being treated and treating others as human beings." And at the time of the triumph of the Cuban Revolution in 1959, discrimination against Black people and against women were correctly identified as wrong and prohibited. And this took place in spite of the traditional prejudices of Cuban society, but it didn't occur with discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. Both traditional Latin American culture and the Catholic Church had a firmly established culture of machismo with a view of homosexuals as weak, deviant, and decadent. And after the revolution, this was not yet seen as one of the things that needed to be changed. In 1965, Cuba was threatened with possible invasion by the United States, and they instituted universal conscription for men between certain ages. But those men who were seen as undesirable for military training, including religious figures, as well as men who were thought to be petty criminals or homosexuals, were sent instead to military units in aid of production. And the boot camp conditions experienced by all were made more severe in these camps, according to the view that these people were burdens on society. And although this policy lasted for only 3 years, a lot of people are aware of them, and the attitudes persisted until changes began in about 1975, when the Cuban Supreme Court ruled that gay artists who had been discharged from work on that basis had a right to claim their jobs back and compensation. In Cuba, adult, non-commercial, consensual same-sex sexual relationships were decriminalized in 1979, something that didn't occur in all states of the US until the Lawrence versus Texas Supreme Court decision of 2003. By 1993, Cuban public policy was that homosexuality is a natural sexual orientation, and that homophobia was a prejudice that should be countered by education. Openly LGBT people have been allowed to serve in the Cuban military since 1993. This didn't occur in the US until 2011 for all except trans people, who were not permitted until 2021. In 1995, Cuban policy was expressed even more, as you could say, dramatically when the May 17th demonstration against homophobia was led by Cuban drag queens, joined by two gay delegations from the United States. And Fidel said in his speech, "I'm absolutely opposed to all forms of oppression, contempt, scorn, or discrimination with regard to homosexuals." Later, he expressed regret that the problem had not been confronted earlier, and he took responsibility for the mistakes. However, public policy is one thing, and changing attitudes is another, usually much more prolonged process. Cuba, unlike the US, has consistently moved in the correct direction. In 1975, Cuba created a new constitution and a body of family law, which are very advanced documents for their time, especially with regard to women's rights. But assumptions then prevalent about heteronormativity and patriarchal authoritarian family structure were included. In 2019, Cuba passed a new constitution by referendum after a long process of consultation with the people and revision. The public comment turned out to be heavily focused on same-sex marriage. The original wording had been, "Marriage is the union voluntarily entered into by two people," and this was revised after public comment and before the referendum. The final version was, "All persons have the right to establish a family. Marriage is a social and legal institution. It's one of the forms by which families can organize. It is founded in the free consent and the equality of rights, obligations, and legal capabilities of the two spouses." And some people thought this was too vague and that it amounted to a cop-out. But then in Cuba, they went on to the process of creating the new code of family law to conform to the new constitution. I'm going to quote the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who said, "The new forms of rights are new forms of participation in decision-making. The concept of democracy is being pushed to deeper levels of meaning, from formal exercise of voting to effective participation in major decisions." Well, that's true in Cuba. Consultation with the people was part of what was revolutionary about the Families Code. Process of consultation was carried out between February and April of 2022, and 6 million Cubans participated, according to Alina Balseiro Gutierrez, the president of the National Electoral Council. In the 5th extraordinary session of the Asamblea Nacional de Poder Popular, the National Assembly of People's Power, which is Cuba's parliament, Alina Balseiro Gutierrez stated that 79,129 meetings took place with 336,595 individual contributions by citizens and 434,860 proposals by voters processed, passed along without altering their content. Cubans love statistics, by the way. Those stats often make them look good. The result of this process was the Families Code, Código de las Familias in Spanish, families, plural. It's a recognition of plurality, families rather than a single model. And this set of laws has over 400 articles protecting not only the right of all people to form a family without discrimination and updating the legal definitions with inclusive models, establishing the right to a family life free from violence, and centering values of love, affection, solidarity, and responsibility. Yeah, it recognizes same-sex marriage. Marriage is the voluntary union of two people on the basis of affection, love, and mutual respect. That's only one part of what's truly revolutionary in the new Families Code. Interestingly enough, the most controversial aspect of the Families Code was not same-sex marriage. It was the concept of parental responsibility, which is parenting taken with actions, always considering the best interests of the child, raising children with love and respect, And with the children having increased participation in decision-making about their lives according to their developmental capacity, the concept of parental responsibility has replaced the legal concept of custody, and some Cubans found that threatening. The new code also gives agency in the same way to those previously considered subjects, children, the aged, people with disabilities. The autonomy of elderly persons is recognized legally. It's also true that people can come together in a partnership based on voluntary affectionate union and make their own decision about whether this should be interpreted as a marriage. So there isn't a common law marriage concept. You declare yourself either a marriage or not a marriage. It does also bring children conceived with techniques of assisted reproduction within the law. It gives rights to the relationship between grandparents and their grandchildren, regardless of what happens to the relationships of the parents. And it stabilizes the right of all relatives who are connected by bonds of love, even when marital relationships change. It also places an economic value on household work and caregiving. For example, for consideration and division of property and for pension plans. In addition, people with disabilities all will be able to exercise their rights to the fullest extent of their capabilities. No legal declarations of incompetence now exist. Some things that don't require new laws, including abortion rights, which, as I said, Cubans have had since 1965, equal pay for equal work, parental leave, all these have been law for a long time. Excuse me for 1 second, I'm just getting over COVID. Sorry. The people of Cuba approved this new progressive families code with an overwhelming majority in a historic national referendum on September 25th, 2022, almost 2 years ago. About 75% of the eligible voters participated, and of these, 67% voted yes, 33% voted no. And this makes several factors obvious. One is that it was a real vote. Another is that not everybody gets it. And those who don't, including fundamentalist churches, are free to offer their opinions. They were free to organize against the Constitution and the Code of the Families and vote against these measures without consequences. But now that these are law, these people in churches don't have the choice to violate the law by discriminating against people they disapprove of. But also, the decisive yes vote points up that revolutionary Cuba, a country under siege by the United States from its very first moments, country that the US has tried to suffocate from its first breath, it has an overwhelming majority of people who believe in justice and equality and human solidarity. And the Cuban people are continuing to make progress in the face of the difficulties imposed by the US. And they're doing this based on democratic and open discussion, sometimes difficult and painful, and they're reaching toward a better world. What I'd like to do now is play you a 3-minute slideshow and then take questions. The music quality is going to be terrible in this slideshow, I'm afraid, because I can't figure out how to shut the music off, and my bandwidth just isn't that great today. There are a lot of pictures of people voting because I do want you to understand that Cuba has a parliamentary system and elects representatives as well as holding referenda, if you prefer, on the Constitution and the Families Code. Children with their sharp eyes and literal minds guard the ballot boxes. And there's a couple of nuances I want you to see in the photos. The group showing up to vote, holding their Bibles, that's the Salvation Army. Yes, there's religious freedom in Cuba. Who told you those lies anyway? And what did they have in mind? On this picture immediately following is a black gentleman with a yellow and green bracelet on his left wrist, and he is an adherent of an African-based religion like Regla Volcha, commonly called Santeria in this country. That's what the bracelet means. And unlike many fundamentalist Protestant churches in Cuba, the African-based religions did not oppose the Constitution or the Family's Code. So let me play the brief slideshow, and then we will be open for questions. If you have questions about the slideshow, that too. Questions?
I don't have a question, but I do want to compliment you on what you've just given to us and the video too. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Maybe there are questions in the chat. I'm not looking at the chat.
Well, Cheryl has her hand raised.
Oh, go ahead, Cheryl.
So the the way the schooling is arranged, how do Cuban students do in like Olympic math international competitions? Do they go in for international competitions, the math Olympiad, the physics Olympiad? How are
I'm
they
not
doing?
aware of any Cuban student participation in international competitions like that, so I can't answer your question. I can tell you that all Cuban schools are public schools. There are no private or religious schools. That it's free from preschool all the way up through professional school, and that Cuba produces a large number of highly educated professionals, many of them from families where, you know, traditionally these would not have been able to, you know, go to school, from families in rural areas, from families who are campesinos, from families who are poor urban people.
Okay, thank you.
So, Lenny, there is a question in the chat. It's from Ellen Mass. She says, how are Cubans today taking advantage of the code? Can you give us any factual implementation of the code?
Well, there have been hundreds of marriages, you know, same-sex marriages. That's one thing. They're still working out a lot of the minutiae. I just read an article the other day about, you know, what was retroactive and what was not retroactive, and how this would work out in terms of pension plans. I was told an anecdote recently, fairly recently, it was actually last spring, by a woman who has been working both for increased recognition of women's rights and increased recognition of the contributions of people of the African diaspora in Cuba. And she was telling me about a marriage that had taken place in one of the traditional Cuban marriage palaces. And then the tradition is, and it was two guys, they had waited a long time to get legally married. And the tradition was you leave the marriage palace in a convertible, honking your horn and making all kinds of noise. And they were doing that, and people were tossing them kisses from the sidewalk and from the buses. And her heart was so warmed by this. She felt that it really did represent a societal change. Why can I not see the chat? It just says show chat previews. Oh, here we are.
So there's another question, Lenny, and it's about, is there a WILPF trip planned to Cuba this winter?
I hope so. Cindy is working on that, and I think so. And yes, this would be a really good way to go to Cuba initially as a WILPF trip. I think when you first go to Cuba, you probably do need to go with a group, with a delegation. Figuring out how to maneuver in Cuba, especially now, with all the shortages and problems that have occurred since the Trump crackdown on Cuba economically, and the fact that Biden's policy on Cuba has been identical to Trump's. So that Cuba is suffering from fuel shortages at this time, and it's hard to get around. I think you should go with a delegation the first time, at least. I wanted to say something about that too. If there are no more immediate questions, I just want to say this. The world is increasingly digitized, and so it's harder and harder for Cuba to do workarounds around the blockade, and workarounds around the fact that just before Trump, took his dirty butt out of the Oval Office and started inciting riots and insurrections, he put Cuba back on the US state sponsors of terrorism list with absolutely no evidence for any sponsorship of terrorism. Oddly enough, and we can be the exceptions here. We can be the exception. Oddly enough, it's easier to get people to donate money than to get them to take action, even action as simple as writing or calling Biden and Harris and insisting that Cuba be taken off the US state sponsors of terrorism list. This list does terrible damage because it signals to banks internationally that if they do any kind of business with Cuba, they're likely to face US sanctions. And again, there's really no place to hide now. And there's no way to transfer funds internationally, aside from through bank institutions. And so they won't deal with Cuba as long as Cuba is on this list. So please tell the president and vice president of the US that Cuba has to be removed from this list. This is a priority for Cuba. It's not the blockade that can only be changed by congressional action. It was done by executive action and it can be undone by executive action. I'll put something in the chat for people who want more information. There are other things you can do for Cuba, but that would be absolutely the first priority. So, more questions. I want more questions.
There was some comments in the chat that Cuba, all students learn to play an instrument that in Cuba. And also when Virginia Pratt was there, people paid less than 10% of their income for rent.
Yeah, the majority of Cuban people own their own dwelling. It isn't always a house. Many times it's a sort of an apartment, a space. Yeah. I was told something interesting by Magia Lopez, who's half of Duo Obsession. You should check them out if you get a chance. It's her parents were renting basically a room or two rooms at the time of the Cuban Revolution, and the Cuban Revolution took these houses away from large landholders and landlords and gave them to the people who were living in them. And it was amazing for her parents. It's like, we own something. This is incredible. And then as the kids grew up, they were like, how come we're only living in two rooms when some people who were wealthier before the revolution are living in a whole house? So it was an attitude change from, isn't this amazing? There's something that's ours, to why not? Why isn't it even more equal? Duo Obsession, check them out. Cuban hip hop at its finest, conscious hip hop. You'd love it.
Okay, well, Leni, I don't think there's any more questions. I don't see any. And I think you've been so great. And there've been lots of comments in the chat about how wonderful your presentation was. And I thought and it's being recorded, and Ellen will put it up on the WILPF US Today. Right, Ellen? WILPF US Today. So you can all go look at it. The YouTube
on
video.
YouTube. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you. That's so great. So now we're going to go into the part where people, particularly, I like to kind of start with anyone on the board who wants to make any kind of announcements. And then I have, here's a hand. Mario, do you want to say something?
I would just like to say hi to Leni.
Mario. Oh, I know. Oh, yeah. All right. 2022 Caravan.
Yeah. So
Right
pleasure
on.
to see you, and glad to see you're still active. So just wanted to say hi and appreciate, of course, everything you've been doing over the years. So
Long distance revolutionary.
Keep it going.
Take care. Good to see you.
Thank you for coming.
I'm seeing Virginia's comment about homeless people, and I think that she is mostly correct. There are some people in Cuba who choose not to be housed. That said, you know, most people have a place to live. Most people own it. It's often quite small and pretty cramped.
Yeah, but she says she didn't see any homeless people, whereas here, I think anyone who goes anywhere just about sees them.
Homelessness
US
is rare
now.
in Cuba, and it's somewhat of a personal choice when it exists. Yeah.
That's
And
great.
again, most people own their homes. They or their you know, and they rather than rent them.
Great. Okay, so is there, I can't see everyone who is here. Are there any announcements from the board? Anyone on the board? I don't see any. So now I'm going to go to committee chairs. Anyone who wants to say anything? Cheryl has her hand raised, I believe. Go ahead, Cheryl.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Speaking on behalf of the Disarm End Wars Committee, I wanted to give you a heads up on what we will be doing in September. In particular, we will be joining a US-wide effort to what we're saying, pressure the profiteers. So we have companies that help make nuclear weapons and make the missiles that deliver the nuclear weapons. They make a lot of money, and they actually have offices and factories all over the country. And there's a marvelous map that Warheads to Windmills has put together, which shows you where all the offices are of L3 Harris, of Raytheon, and what have you. So you can probably find one of the offices of one of those companies, weapons manufacturer companies, within a few miles of your hometown. So the idea is to either you go out and demonstrate outside their facility, or have an op-ed. And Warheads to Windmills has this lovely resourceful website that I'm going to put a link in the chat. They have even written an op-ed for you that you can take and just, you know, modify it slightly to apply to your hometown, essentially saying, you know, nuclear weapons are dangerous for all of us, and we need to get rid of them, and that, you know, people who are working in those weapons factories, they have the same skill set as people who would need to be working on new technologies for producing electricity without using fossil fuels. So it's 1 week on nuclear weapons and another week, the following week, on the fossil fuel companies who are making money still. And so you will be seeing an e-news article about this, leading you to some of these resources, and we will be sending emails to branches. So we're hoping that every branch in the country will realize they have, even if it's a small facility that doesn't actually do the work, we want the companies to realize that there's an awful lot of people outside our offices complaining about what our company does, even though that particular office may not do it, but it's like a nationwide effort to bring attention to the public on what's happening, and the fact that you know, it's not. And also you can stand outside Lawrence Livermore Lab and Los Alamos Lab, where they actually make the nuclear weapons. It's all the other parts of it that we are also trying to attack. So that's one of our many campaigns that Disarm End Wars Issue Committee is doing. But this one's coming up 16th of September for 2 weeks. So I'm hoping those of you who are in branches, and even if you're not in a branch, if you're a Jane Addams person, then that's your opportunity to write an op-ed for your local newspaper, for example. So thank you for hearing me out. Thank you.
Yes, and Jane Addams is a branch, but it's just not a local branch, it's a virtual branch. So I feel that Jane Addams members really have a great opportunity to reach out to people all over the country in the area they represent. So hopefully you can do that. Okay, I see Teresa Elamine has her hand raised and AHR. Go ahead, Teresa.
Thank you. Sorry to be so late. But right at 8 o'clock, the only man on the 9-member school board in the Muskogee County School District called me because he wanted to let me know that he had a donation for the work that we're doing here around affordable housing and education equity, which is really important because the number of unhoused students in the Muskogee County School District is in the thousands. It's a 29,000 student school district. And when I heard the person who provides the services for the students report at a community meeting where we're building this collaboration, we're calling Building a Village. So members of the Fannie Lou Hamer branch and members of the Southern Anti-Racism Network, along with school board members and United Way and lots of other groups are involved in this Building a Village project, which is actually about 12 years old. And this is a bit of a restart, but the Advancing Human Rights Committee has 4 working groups. One of them is housing justice. And it just came online earlier this year because of the crisis this everywhere when it comes to housing and the unhoused. The other 3 working groups for advancing human rights are the UN Decade Reparations. And that working group will be meeting tomorrow, Thursday at 6:30 p.m. via Zoom. And Fatima Peary Smith, who's based in New Orleans, has agreed to be the convener. So that's very important. And so she'll be kind of coming out tomorrow to say what her thoughts are. She's a longtime NCOBRA member, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations, in very important organization that started in the 80s. And then we have a new member who joined, who lives in Greenville, South Carolina, who was a founding member of NCOBRA, and she goes to the a permanent forum on people of African descent in Geneva. And so she's now a part of WILPF. So we continue to recruit. Just as an aside, we're continuing to recruit WILPF members across a wide geographic area based on the attraction of the Fannie Lou Hamer branch, which the Southern Anti-Racism Network is the fiscal sponsor. Since we haven't had access to many grants, it's important when donors call to say they want to make a donation to SARN, because quite a bit of that work, quite a bit of the donations we get spent on work that's actually being done in the name of WILPF through the branch here in Columbus. But the other working groups we have are ending mass incarceration and the death penalty and the border and migration justice. So there are actually 4 working groups for advancing human rights. And we had a really good meeting on Sunday where Adrian Bernal, who's in the Metro Atlanta branch, is the convener. of border and migration justice. And what we talked about is the SOA Watch, which he's on the leadership team of SOA Watch for quite a few years. And so they're doing a back to the border in Arizona, Mexico part of the border, which will be November 15, 16. So hopefully people in the region in Arizona will make that trek to the border, as many people used to come to Columbus, Georgia, from WILPF with the WILPF flags. And WILPF always had a powerful presence at those demonstrations around the SOA Watch. And so we're hoping that people can support the effort to build at the border in Arizona this November. So that's part of the border and migration justice activities over the next few months, is building that. So we'll be talking about that probably at the September meeting on the 15th of September. And so these human rights issues that are coming out of advancing human rights are in large part racial justice issues. And I'm really concerned that the Advancing Human Rights page at the website is really out of date. And I did email Darian and George Friday, and hopefully George Friday is on this extended vacation for her 65th birthday. And when she gets back on this side of the world, hopefully she can help to correct the page. But I do want to say that it is such a dynamic time for mass movement building. And it is a bit unfortunate that the branches of WILPF are weaker than I've seen in quite a while. And so there are a few strong branches, and certainly the DMV branch is doing miraculous things over its 2 years. And so all of the branches are relatively small, but the Metro Atlanta branch had its first real meeting to try to get really going. That was last night. And so I'm hoping that branches in the South and members of the Jane Addams Branch, Diane, who are based in the South in places like Tennessee, Kentucky, etc., will be a part of our October Southern Region meeting, which will be a hybrid. It'll be in person at the radio station where Adrian Bernal will be providing space for us to have it, no charge. So those of us who are near Atlanta will drive into Atlanta for the in-person part of the Southern Region meeting. And then we'll have Zoom, because Adrian is very good with tech stuff. So we'll have a Zoom part to it. So it'll be a hybrid meeting in October. So watch for that. The Southern Region is moving forward. It's just getting so exciting, the work that's being done across the South. And so we want to keep building those branches in the South. And hopefully Fatima in New Orleans will get that New Orleans branch going. But my goal has always been around organizing in the South. And so that's what's going on in my world, advancing human rights and building branches in the South. That's what I'm all about.
Thank you, Teresa. Well, I want to build branches throughout the United States. So hopefully we can, this is, you know, the Jane Addams is virtual. Ideally, we have local branches so that people can meet with each other, and that's those bonds, those personal in-person bonds are really great. So I mean, ideally everyone's in a local branch, but for so many people it's not possible. So that's why we have the Jane Addams branch, which is at least something, and you get the news and things. So Teresa, you gave not only the AHR report, but also a branch report, and you mentioned the regional regional conferences that we are supposed to be going to work on. So there will be a Northeast Regional Conference and a South. They're working on deciding where these regions are going to be and when they're going to be and everything. So since we didn't have the in-person national conference, this is an attempt to reach out to people. So everyone should be hearing more about those conferences that hopefully will be held before by next spring. So that's coming up. So if there's no other issue committee chairs that want to speak, we're going to have any branch leaders that want to speak about any branch activities. And if I don't see a hand soon, we're just going to open up to discussion for anybody who wants to ask a question or say anything about WILPF activities. Cheryl, I see your hand is raised, so go ahead.
Yes, the Peninsula Palo Alto branch of WILPF, which that's the peninsula south of San Francisco here in California. We have been working for 6 years to try to get an ordinance passed by our city council that's based on CEDAW. Now, you heard Leni mention CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And we got our council to agree that they should have an ordinance, and they directed staff to start working on it. It was 6 years ago, and it's still not worked on. So the other day, every year or two, I go to one of these, the subcommittee, that Policy and Services Subcommittee of the City of Palo Alto City Council, and say, okay, please let the staff work on this. And we know that the staff really do want to work on this ordinance, because one of the things they have to do is to do a demographic survey to see if the women who are employed by the city are getting equal pay to the men who are employed by the city. And I think the women staff have a feeling they probably aren't. So they're actually anxious that there should be this ordinance which would direct the city to make also the things equal for the women residents and girl residents. So anyway, that is just one of the things that my branch does. We have 2 other committees. We concentrate on nuclear weapons and disarmament, and we concentrate on housing, really affordable housing. We have been fighting for that, and again, attending city council and trying to move the city in the direction of allowing more buildings. So I can hear my husband shouting, so I'm going to get shut up now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So where I live in Fairfax County, we worked on getting CEDAW passed for many years. We finally got it passed. And so there's since the United States is one of the few countries that hasn't ratified it, we at county and city levels, they're trying to get it passed. So that is something that everyone could be working on too. Okay, Tina has her hand raised. So Tina, why don't you go ahead?
I wanted to share that, come on, video. The DMV branch is requesting to have a side event at the UN Summit of the Future, or has requested, I should say, and plans are moving forward. So if you are near the New York United Nations on Saturday, September 21st, there will be a side event taking place. I won't take all the time to say a little bit about it, but if you want more information, just reach out and we can pass on the information as it comes. But the DMV branch is coordinating that, and there's no one here from that branch, so I thought I'd throw it out. I know some people who are visiting with Robin this last week also got a bit of a taste of it. But so anyway, lower hand. There we go.
Okay,
Uh,
thank
Tina,
you.
Tina, it was great to see Joan Wider at the Border and Migration meeting on Sunday. Could you say a little bit more about what's going on in Greater Philadelphia? Because I was just so impressed with that branch when I visited there for the event we had. Gosh, it's been a year ago.
You mean what our branch is doing?
Yeah.
Sure. We are getting ready to participate in a International Peace Day Philly to celebrate the International Day of Peace. We're coordinating with Korea Peace Now to show the film Crossings. We are continuing our discussion groups on anti-racism and kind of doing our own internal work with that, with Zoom meetings that are open to others. We had an in-person meeting earlier this month to support each other in our nonpartisan election efforts, and just kind of plugging along.
Great. That's great. Thank you. So I have 3 hands raised. I don't know the order that I should take them in, but how about Ellen? And well, I'll do Ellen and then Cynthia Roberts. So Ellen, why don't you unmute? Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so we were at Robbins this weekend for the weekend. I see Virginia's the only other one that was there. Jan Quarterman was there, of course. But we did talk quite a bit on Summit of the Future with some Pan-African women. And women came in from Detroit and from Philadelphia. And they were from all over the place. Jan came from Des Moines. And so it was 3 days of heavy WILPF doses of our programs and support of different progressive movements, like in Venezuela. And we talked quite a bit about Palestine, and someone was read letters from someone from the Gaza that was touching and moved all of us very, very much. And then at the end, there was someone from Togo. Actually, he was from the Ivory Coast, and they were talking about the big conference coming up in Togo that connects to the UNESCO Summit of the Future. So that was really quite interesting. It was we are very much, WILPF is very much encouraged to be a participant and have a side activity there. I think Robin will send that out probably to it'll get on the e-list of WILPF, I'm sure. But it was very, very fun too, and beautifully done, and such a tribute to Robin's ability to bring people together and in a very positive way for building WILPF. So there were, I guess, about, I don't know, over the whole week and weekend, it was probably about 20 people. But Virginia, if you have anything more to add, it was just a grand WILPF activity.
That's great. I think she's had it for, I don't know how many years, but many years, once a year. And it was labeled Vermont Peace gathering, but it's people from all over WILPF, all over have attended. So great. Thank you, Ellen, for that report. And Cynthia Roberts has her hand raised. Cynthia, go ahead.
Hello. I just wanted to pick up on what Leni said about not to stop talking about Palestine, and being on the committee of which she is co-chair on Cuba. I'm not sure it was mentioned, but with the talk of Palestine, Cuba at the Latin American Medical Science School, the ELAM, trains many, many Palestinian students. And there was just one who spoke as part of a DNC webinar that the some of the Chicago folks put together. He had to come in by a pre-taped video because Zoom usually can't get through to do these Zoom calls, but or to do Zoom calls. But anyway, he talked about his family, and they were living, their house had been bombed, and that part of it was still livable. And they then bombed the house again. Fortunately, the family was gone, but that the father was there and was heavily bleeding, and the shortage of supplies in Palestine. But then he went on to talk about Cuba and how they're so in dire need of medicines there as well, and that they are so appreciative of everything, any medicines or the Saving Lives campaign, which was also touched on. So yeah, I just wanted to put that in there, and how the many ways we can help Cuba, and just how they're helping train Palestinian doctors.
Yeah, well, they train doctors from all over the world. I knew some people from the US who went, and the theory is you go back and you help so it's a
Exactly.
wonderful, wonderful program that they have in Cuba.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, and was there someone else who wanted to say something? I'm opening up the floor to everyone. Any questions? So is the Saving Lines campaign that pacemakers thing?
Yeah.
Is that the same? Okay. Okay, and Leni put the information about that in the chat. So, okay. Anybody else want to say? Oh, Sin, do you want to say something else?
No, oh, sorry. I got to put my hand down.
Yeah, okay, okay. But, okay, and Teresa has to leave, and we'll all be going soon. Mario, you have your hand raised, so go ahead.
I'd just like to go back to some of the things that Leni raised in her presentation, which, I've been writing notes to myself here. One of them is, of course, the women's organization that was started right after the revolution, in 1960. And, for an organization of women. And I understand that I'm here and joining an organization of women here. And I'm just wondering why it is that women in the United States have not, I know there's been a women's movement, and we had the NOW, et cetera, but I still don't see women in the United States, who I believe are the majority of the population, really, joining up to create, I'd hate to use the military term, a critical mass, we really need to explode the corrupt government we have running this country, who is dominated by the war machine and corporate money. Anyway, that's just one thought, it's like, the other thing that you mentioned is the civic participation, behind not just the families code, but, any number of other things, the local block by block organization. We visited one of those communities, when we were in Cuba. And, just talking about the United States, why is it that we now live in what we call a democracy, but we really, ordinary people, have no voice? We've been shut out of our own government. And, my response to that, I don't want to talk too much, but I've raised it here at our local WILPF chapter, is, even more powerful than writing a letter to your congressman or calling them up or whatever is, my suggestion is, we need to abandon these parties. We need to change our voter registration. When you change your voter registration away from Republican or Democrat, that is the strongest possible message you can send. You stop giving them money. We really need in this country to create an alternative of the vast majority of this population that is fed up with this government is doing, but we keep playing the game. We keep complaining about them, and then we keep voting them back into power. So this may be the Zapatista in me speaking, but we may have to vote for them in this election. You know, it's like they've got it set up so it's okay. Well, yin or yang, or I mean, I know I'm sorry that's an insult to yin and yang, but you get the idea. I mean, we've got to look for another way, and it really comes to the idea of we need a government that we participate in and that we have a voice in, that comes from the bottom up and not just from the top down in a tidal wave of money. So thank you very much. Sorry.
Absolutely, absolutely. You're so right. I totally agree. Leni, response is, go ahead, Leni.
Well, I agree with you. First, I want to just do a quick, one more screen share. The Elam student on the left is from Palestine. The Elam student on the right is from South Africa. So I had the chance to visit Elam in 2016 when the classes were in session, and it was interesting. I went to a class on community and environmental medicine. And as you may or may not know, from countries where education is more limited even than in the US and more money-based, they take students right out of secondary education as Elam students, and it's a 6-year program. And there were a number of students who acted just like high school students, you know, not the South African student or the Palestinian student. They were right there answering all the questions. But some other students who would kind of look down, look away, you know, not participate. And I asked the professor afterwards, I'm like, how can you really make good doctors out of these students? And she said, yes, but not just in the classroom. You know, this is a lived process. We have to work with them, and we have to basically provide an example. We have to show them how to do it. And I think in a way that's relevant to Mario's comments. Che said, in order to be a revolutionary doctor, first you have to have a revolution. And I think in order to have a revolutionary mass organization of women, maybe first you have to have a revolution too. And so I don't know how to bring that about, but I think we're all working on it a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I don't know who Samsung SMA1 is, but go ahead and introduce yourself, please, and go and unmute. Unmute. Samsung, you have to unmute.
There we go.
Oh, this is Claudia Fatima Peary Smith, and I'm the new convener of the Reparations Committee. And I just want to greet everybody. I'm sorry I came a little late, but I was having some Zoom technical difficulties, but I'm glad to be here. And I would just like to mention that I'm 74 years old, and my grandmother was a pioneering African-American WILPF member. And she remained a WILPF member her entire life. And while she wasn't exactly what you would call outwardly famous, she carried out WILPF principles. She spread the WILPF philosophy, and she died in 2000 at 106 as a WILPF member. So I was a little bit more radical than she was, but now that I'm her age, I understand why she was a WILPF member. So myself and 2 of my daughters have joined WILPF as well. And I'm just very honored to be in your presence. This is an organization that I feel has worked sensibly and has been dedicated and has not been about glory. It's been about honest change. The media and hustlers, everybody exploits movements that are not exactly approved of totally by the system that we live under. And the way that WILPF has worked, and I knew that the first protest that I ever attended, my grandmother took me to it, and I was 11 years old. WILPF was protesting against South African apartheid in the 60s.
it didn't become fashionable until the 90s. This is the kind of thing that I look at when we think about WILPF. So this organization has a tremendous heritage. And 74 years old, we still have to fight racism. And what has happened with, I feel, with the mainstream civil rights movement is they introduced what Dr. King vehemently opposed as token integration. They're taking a certain number of people and they have left them through the gate and doing a great PR job with them. Meanwhile, the research shows that it would take the descendants of the African slaves here 350 more years to share the same quality of life that the European American population is able to experience. And when you compare even income stratus, indigenous people and African Americans are still stuck at the very bottom. So I think as long as these kinds of injustices exist, either here or in the world, an organization like WILPF is definitely going to be needed. Go women, go women, go women.
Thank you. I think that was a great ending for the meeting. Thank you all. So take care. Take care. Another
Thanks,
meeting.
Ann.
Tina's going to be doing the meeting next month on Project 2025. Yes. Is there another question?
No, we're saying thank you.